It is our honor to have our guest today, Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr., who currently serves as a principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. And over the past couple of years, as we've navigated through this pandemic, Chief Hoskin has led the way by example, as he has just done a tremendous job navigating very difficult circumstances. And while there have been many leaders of different tribes that have had a lot of success, he's definitely been one of those at the forefront, leading by example. So it's our honor today to have Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. Welcome to the show, Chief.
Very good to be with you, Sean. Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Of course, we want to talk about the potential representation for the Cherokee Nation within the House of Representatives upcoming soon, hopefully. But before we do that, I just want to talk a little bit about your career. Of course, you served in many different positions within the Cherokee Nation, including as Secretary of State. But in 2019, you were elected as the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. So I just want to start right there and ask you, what did it feel like when you received that vote of confidence from the Cherokee Nation and you had been elected as the chief principal for the Cherokee Nation?
Felt a great deal of pride, in some ways surreal to think about being chief of the Cherokee Nation. To be a tribal leader, I think, is a great honor. One of the things I thought about then, and I still think about today, and this doesn't make me unique among tribal leaders, but something I think about is, my grandfather lived most of his life in a world in which you couldn't vote for a Cherokee chief. The government of the United States, which prides itself on being a democracy, had dismantled the Cherokee democracy for most of his lifetime. I don't imagine he ever saw a world in which his grandson would be the chief, and yet it happened. And that's not just something about me. It says something about where we are as a country and where we are in Indian country, increasingly exercising our sovereignty. I think every time we have an election in Indian country, every time we choose our leaders, it's something special. It's something sacred. And to be, at least for this snapshot of time, the focus of that in my election, well, that's just something that was wonderful for me personally.
Absolutely. Now, we talked about the fact that you didn't waste time. You hit the ground running, making several significant impacts right off the bat, including one of your first actions was to seat a congressional delegate that had been agreed upon between the United States government and the Cherokee Nation in the 1835 treaty. Now, for people outside of the Cherokee Nation, I know myself included, I was really surprised when I heard about this potential selection into the House of Representatives. I never heard about it before. And so for me, it was just, it was exhilarating. It felt empowering, if you will, because the thought of having somebody within our tribal communities that would be standing there within the House of Representatives, not just as a native representing a state, but representing a tribal nation. I thought that was just such an amazing thing. So my question for you is this, when did you realize that this was an option? And when did you know that you were going to move forward in selecting someone to sit as a representation for the Cherokee Nation, and this was going to become a reality?
I realized it was an option. I was a young law student. I was a delegate to our constitutional convention in 1999, and it was brought up at that convention. And like you, I was sort of amazed and enamored really with the idea. And it was placed into our Constitution in terms of the mechanisms for effectuating that Treaty of 1835, Treaty of New Echota, as it's called. But it really sat dormant for that period of time until August of 2019, not because the leaders before me didn't care about it. They cared a great deal. I think there's something about timing in Indian country and making sure you move at the right moment for strategic reasons. And I think that over a period of time, Cherokee Nation has gained strength politically and economically, met some challenges that we had to resolve, really, I think, before we could do this. And so the first question is, when I realized it in 1999, when I realized it could be done, when I took office, I thought, look, this is a treaty right. If not now, when? And it felt like the moment was right. I did realize it would be a long journey, and we're still on that journey. But But it was, when I took office, I thought we have to do this, and I had a lot of great help to sort of formulate how to do it, and from our Attorney General to Kim Teehee herself. We'll talk about her more, I'm sure, but she's our delegate to Congress designate.
Absolutely. Now, as you made mention of, you selected Kimberly Teehee to be the first delegate for the Cherokee Nation. And man, does she ever have an impressive resume. I mean, she served in the Obama administration. She is so respected both inside and outside the indigenous community. And I'm just curious what led to her selection. And I imagine that she had to be excited. What was her response when she found out that she would be the first delegate for the Cherokee Nation in the House of Representatives?
Well, certainly it was. So what led to her selection is she had already been the executive director of government relations under my predecessor, Chief Baker. I had also worked for Chief Baker as the Secretary of State and worked closely with Kim. And what she did both individually as executive director of government relations and building a team, which is really important, I think, in tribal government, is building that team of talented people. Was really effective. I mean, there are a number of accomplishments I could check off in terms of just her time at Cherokee Nation, but we had some major reform to some Indian land title legislation that came down to the 11th hour towards the end of, I think, 2019, perhaps the end of it was the end of 2019. That, among a host of other effective acts of advocacy on her part, led me to think this person is the right one for the job. If you just look at Kim Teehee's resume, you couldn't write one. I mean, honestly, Hollywood probably couldn't write a better script for somebody to make a journey to this point. She humble origins, goes to college and just excels. Interns from Wilma Mankiller, while Wilma Mankiller was our chief, goes off to law school, goes into government service, working on Capitol Hill, works some in the private sector, advocating for the interest of Indian country, then comes back home in a very real way to the Cherokee Nation. I've left out something incredibly important. I said she worked on Capitol Hill. She, as you mentioned, she worked in the White House for President Obama. So well-rounded, so well-versed. When I thought about initially, we need to appoint the delegate to Congress, it's going to take somebody that can really push this through. I thought Kim Teehee can help us push it through. And then I thought Kim Teehee needs to be the delegate. And so that was the selection. And I met with her in her office, and she got a bit emotional, I think, with the joy and the pride of the prospect of doing this. And she accepted, and we've been on a journey from there.
Absolutely. And what I said about Ms. Teehee is so true, how qualified she is. But what she has that I believe is so special is her ability to operate both in the tribal world and the world outside of the tribe. As indigenous people, we have dual citizenships. We are citizens of our tribal nation, and we are citizens of the United States of America. And many times the difficult and the struggle is being able to navigate, because we've got one foot in our culture and our community and our tribe, and the other in a world that maybe we don't always naturally fit so well. And so the ability to navigate both of those is very difficult, but it's something that Kimberly has done very well. And I imagine that had to be a part of the process and the selection for you.
John, what you just laid out is so important. And I think particularly for young people that might be watching and thinking about their career, young natives who are thinking about sort of their place in the world and how they can make a difference. There's a lot of great examples to look to, but Kim is certainly one of them. And so somebody that does have the ability to walk in both worlds and genuinely does so. And I think that's what leadership in Indian country is all about. The country is awash in very talented lawyers, accountants, business people, healthcare leaders. But I think there's a special quality of someone that comes from particularly tribal communities, remembers where they came from. And then if they can come back home, not just come back home and earn a paycheck, but come back home in this very real way where you're part of your tribe. And there's something about that is almost indefinable, but you know it when you see it. And you certainly know it when you see and visit with Kim Teehee. That, I think, makes the most effective tribal leaders, because when you're doing this job or her job or any number of leadership positions, you're doing something that's much bigger than yourself. And you really feel like you're doing something that could be of generational impact, and you're thinking about your ancestors. I think that's what is the special quality that she brings. There's a lot of other Native leaders in the country that do the same, but she brings that, and I hope that young people sort of see themselves, young Natives, as being able to do that, and we sure need them for sure.
Absolutely. Now, you made mention of the fact that you expected this to be a long process, but I've got to be honest with you. To me, it should have been very simple. This was an agreement made between the Cherokee Nation and the United States of America. Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution says that all treaties shall be the supreme law of the land. So for me, this is very simple. It is within both the treaty rights, it is both within the constitutional right, and this should happen very quickly. So my question for you is this, Chief Hoskins: where are we in this process, and what needs to happen next?
We're pushing for action by the United States House of Representatives, and that action can follow different paths. One path that it can follow, and I think should follow, is a hearing before the appropriate committee. That hearing then could turn into legislative action, which could take the form of the House simply taking action on its own without the need for any further Senate action to seat Kim Teehee. They can do this. I think it is important to break down for viewers how simple the proposition is, how simple the language is. The Treaty of New Echota is the treaty that removed the Cherokee people. I'm thinking about John Ross, who was a chief at the time, 1830s, during the period of Indian removal. I know federal leaders looked across the table as he was resisting removal and saying this is unjust. And they would say, I know they would say it, Chief Ross, this is the law of the land. It's the supreme law of the land. And they would point to the articles of the Constitution that you talked about. They point to the treaty and they would say, Chief, you shall abide by it. That's what we're doing. We're saying this is the supreme law of the land. And we point to the Constitution, we point to the language of the treaty, and we say, frankly, you should abide by it, United States. What does the treaty language say? It's very simple. It says the Cherokee Nation shall have a delegate in the United States House of Representatives when Congress shall make provision for the same. Now, it doesn't say we might have a representative or we may. It says we shall. And then it says when Congress shall make provision for the same. That's where we are now, is trying to get Congress to make provision for it. But it seems to me, Sean, that is not something that's permissive. It's not a variable. It is something that they must do. The framers of the treaty, and we don't know a great deal in terms of documents written on the side or contemporaneous accounts of what that language means. But what we do know is the plain language seems simple. There does not seem to be an avenue where Congress doesn't do this. The avenue seems to be Congress should do this, and how. So how we got to the point where we're waiting on a hearing might sound like we haven't gotten very far. I think we've gotten very far in the sense that we've plowed a lot of ground in addressing questions raised by members of Congress. One of the natural questions that they raised was, look, Chief, it's the 21st century. You and every other Cherokee are citizens of respective states. Most live in the 2nd Congressional District in Oklahoma. You have a member of Congress. Is there some issue with dual representation? And Sean, we could get down into some real legal analysis here, but the simplest way I can describe it is how I've described it to members of Congress, including the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, which is the treaty seems to talk about the Cherokee Nation's governmental interests, that the Cherokee Nation shall have this delegate. And in our own Constitution, which frankly warrants the respect of the United States, it says that the chief shall appoint Cherokee Nation's delegate. So it's very much a unique type of seat in the House of Representatives representing a tribal government. But that's the reason that it's also not dual representation. There are other issues that were raised that we answered. We've done a really deep dive in terms of the history of not just the treaty, but also the United States. The fact of the matter is the United States has had unelected people in the House of Representatives early in the history of the Republic. That's not the case now. Everyone is elected, but there is a history of that. That was another issue that we had to address, the unelected nature of our delegate. We've answered all the questions, and we haven't had a hard no from anyone. In fact, we had a great deal of enthusiasm from the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and also members of the Oklahoma delegation, including Congressman Mullen, who is a Republican. And I'll tell you, if there's two people that are philosophically different in the House of Representatives, it's Nancy Pelosi and Markwayne Mullen, and yet they both see the wisdom and necessity of keeping this treaty right. One message, though, I send to members of Congress and to our citizens and to everyone is that this is really about whether the United States ought to keep a promise. It's really about whether treaties matter anymore, and they should. So a victory here is very much an affirmation of the proposition that treaties are the supreme law of the land and that there's not an expiration date on them and that they ought to be put into effect. That is the simple truth. And it seems like a simple path, Sean. It's not been a short path. I'm confident we'll get there, but my goodness, it is taking a while.
You know, and one of the things that I like to talk about when talking to people about any treaty right issue is this should be an across the aisle conversation that everybody agrees upon. Because no matter where you stand on the First Amendment or the Second Amendment or the Third Amendment or whatever amendment you want to pull out, if you're, I've got to fight for this, right? I've got to fight for Article 6 is just as much a part of the US Constitution as those are. And if we allow the US government to break Article 6, then nothing stops them from breaking any other amendment or article within that Constitution. And I think that's where it should bring that unified voice. This is, if the Constitution, and some of the ones who fight against some of these things are the ones who call themselves constitutionalists, but Article 6 is just as much part of the Constitution as any other part of it.
It sure is. And I think those scholars and legislators and even jurists who look at the Constitution and want to find original meaning in plain language, if they look at Article 6, it's quite plain. And the propositions in there and the directives in there are straightforward. And it does seem to me that we live in a country where it's still the case that there's a pause before you put into effect a promise made to an Indian tribe. It shouldn't be a pause anymore. I think we're making some progress in this country, but we've got a lot further to go. I mean, there ought to be a day and age in which looking at a treaty is no different than looking at any other statute. Of course, you put it into effect. If there's a disagreement about it, you can always test it to the judiciary. But people in this country presuppose that the text of a statute ought to be put into effect, or the text of the Constitution ought to be put into effect. Why there's this hesitancy when it comes to rights afforded to Indian tribes through treaties born of, as you say, the Article 6 of the Constitution mandates, I'm not sure, but we're going to keep pushing. And I think when we are victorious in seating Kim Teehee, it does reaffirm the idea that treaties are the law of the land, that Article 6 matters. And then that's not the end of the story. We have to keep pushing. And I'm certainly aware that Cherokee Nation's assertion of this treaty right, it's not the first treaty right that's been asserted. We're not breaking new ground in that respect. But I think every time we achieve success in any one treaty, all treaties are strengthened. And I think that's the reason that Indian countries really responded well to our effort to assert this specific treaty provision. We need a great deal of help. We need a great deal of help to get this done. But I'm really feeling it out there that there's a lot of support.
Absolutely. Now, earlier in the interview, you made mention to the fact that it isn't just facts and details that matter, that timing matters as well. And I couldn't agree with you more. And I believe that we are in the most crucial time that we've been in many decades, at least since the 70s, in defending tribal sovereignty. Because right now, ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, is before the Supreme Court. And it is not Child Protective Services or one of these groups that's trying to get this law overturned, which guarantees the right for Native children to stay in Native homes and Native communities. It isn't Child Protective Services that's challenging it. It's the big oil lawyers working pro bono that are trying to overturn this. And they're trying to argue that we are not nations, but we're a race. And this shouldn't even be a discussion. Supreme Court should have never taken it up. I mean, the reality is this matter was solved when the United States of America sat down with our ancestors and their nations and made deals and made treaties, because the United States of America only makes treaties with nations. So that should settle it right there in the fact. But we are at such a crucial time where we are fighting to defend our sovereignty, even though it is not only guaranteed in our treaties, but in the US Constitution as well. But my question for you is this: do you agree that a seated delegate for the Cherokee Nation right now would be a massive win for all tribal nations, because it's a victory in the area of treaties in which we're all fighting for right now?
Sean, because if there was a time when we need champions in the Congress, it's now. On a bipartisan basis, we have some champions in Congress. Then we have a great many members of Congress that are unaware, not steeped in Indian law or policy. They just don't interact with them on a day-to-day basis. And then for sure, we have some enemies of sovereignty, and they are some in the Congress. More so, unfortunately, in some of the states, including the state of Oklahoma. We still, though, need all the champions we can get. And I can just imagine Kim Teehee taking her seat in the House and being able to debate the issues of the day that affect Indian country, and doing it in such a powerful way, and advocating at the committee level and introducing legislation, pushing back on other legislation. It's a very real thing when you think about it. I mean, in Oklahoma, we're dealing with an issue that has nationwide Indian country implications. That's the McGirt case, another legal issue that tests the idea of whether the United States has to keep its promise. In the case of McGirt, it has to do with reservation boundaries and the place of tribal governments in the criminal justice system. That is under attack even by the governor of the state of Oklahoma, Kevin Stitt. Another reason we need counters to people like Kevin Stitt, who very much has this early 19th century view of the world in which tribes and tribal sovereignty is a problem, and you solve that problem by wiping reservation lines off the map or otherwise pushing tribes away. Similar with ICWA. ICWA is under attack, and it's the tired old suggestion that this is some sort of a racial preference or handout to a race of Indians, when the truth of the matter is what ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, is about is respecting tribal sovereignty and making sure that tribes have a role in protecting the interest of Native children. I mean, we know that about a third of Native children in the 20th century before 1978 were removed from tribal lands and placed in non-Indian homes, and the devastating effect that has had on generations of Natives across Indian country. If that is at risk right now, we've got to have not only more advocacy from the tribes against that sort of attack, we have to have people, frankly, inside the government advocating for our interest. That's why a delegate in the House can also help on that issue. Sean, there's surely issues you and I haven't even thought of yet, because you and I, a few years ago, had we talked, wouldn't have known about the pandemic and the effects that has on tribal lands and tribal communities and people. That also required advocacy for Indian country. And who knows, in the years ahead, there's surely going to be issues that we need to be well equipped to address. And having a delegate is not just good for the Cherokee Nation. It's really good for all of Indian country, because even though tribes are not a monolith and we have some differences in terms of views and policies, vast majority of the issues we all see the same way, and we need to unite, and we can unite behind a delegate.
Absolutely. And you're 100% correct. I live on the Pine Ridge Reservation in the Great Oglala Lakota Nation. I live 5 miles from Wounded Knee, and where the massacre of Wounded Knee took place, but also the occupation of Wounded Knee took place in the 1970s. That, is I know there's a lot of controversial parts of that, but that did help bring forth a lot of legislation that helped, like ICWA, like the Indian Freedom Religious Act. And we are, of course, like the Cherokee Nation, we're within the boundaries of South Dakota, and we've got a governor who's constantly trying to dismiss and dismantle our sovereignty, to try to displace. COVID-19 is going on, and I'm very proud of all of our Ochedi leaders, because she tried to take our checkpoints down. Listen, we have the right within our lands and our territories to protect our people how we saw fit, and that's why I think we've come to a place. We've talked about it a lot, but we're to a place now, like a little bit we saw in Standing Rock not too long ago, where a lot of nations came together, people, and fought for rights. I think that we have to, as nations, right now, in this moment, in this time, we've got to come together, and we've got to stand beside behind the Cherokee Nation and say, listen, Kimberly Teehee is not a representation of just the Cherokee Nation. She's one of our relatives that'll be a voice for us. And I think that's kind of what you're alluding to. She's not just a voice for the Cherokee Nation, we have the same struggles. You're in Oklahoma state, your territories are, we're in South Dakota, but we face a lot of the same issues. Do you see that as kind of a thing that we have to all come together, because she's a voice for all of us?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there's two reasons. If a citizen of an Indian nation anywhere in the country or a tribal leader is thinking about why should I support this, there's really two reasons. One is if you want to strengthen everyone's treaty, everyone's legal status, then help us assert this right and effectuate it and get it solidified so that we can say we've got a win. It's a win for all of Indian country. And then the good part is that the win inures to the benefit of all of us. I mean, imagine having Kim Teehee, a Cherokee woman in the Congress advocating for not just Cherokee issues, but issues that affect all of Indian country. She can do that. You know, all of Indian country has been doing the best we can advocating from the outside of Congress. I mean, imagine if you get somebody on the inside there. I mean, that's going to be important. And today the struggle is asserting Cherokee Nation's treaty right. I believe, though, this is again not the end of the story. It's a new chapter, and we have to keep doing this. And I think as tribes, we do have to recognize that we all do better if we can be unified. Can't be unified on every issue, but the vast majority we can. And so let's get unified behind this issue. Tomorrow it'll be another tribe saying we're going to assert this other right, and we'll be behind those tribes, of course.
Absolutely. And so, Chief Hoskins, we appreciate so much. I know you're super busy and taking time to be with us and to talk about these issues, but I do want to ask one more thing before we go. We want all the tribal nations to get behind the Cherokee Nation on this, but like the Cherokee Nation, we have a lot of great allies that are not indigenous to this land, that are not native to this land, and they support us and they believe and they go behind us when they can. And we have great allies just like the Cherokee Nation. So for both parties, both the indigenous and the allies that we have, what is the best way for people to show support and to really pressure the United States to honor the treaties?
You know, Sean, that's the question of the day. And my answer may seem a little bit old fashioned, but it works. And this is the moment to do it. And that is literally reaching out to your member of Congress, writing your member of Congress. There's times when that's effective, and there's times when it's just not timing wise right to do it. The time is now, because here's what we need. We need a hearing before the House of Representatives. We need people besides myself, somebody that's an elected official with the Cherokee Nation, telling a member of Congress, look, there's this legal right. It's in the treaty. Give it a hearing, seat Kim Teehee. The time is now. The time to keep promises to Indian tribes is now. And I think people can do that in so many different ways. I've got to say, the Lakota Law Project has just been incredible in terms of talking to us even before this interview about this issue and just demonstrating the genuine care and concern about it. And then you've helped us raise this issue across Indian country, and that's generating a lot of, I think, enthusiasm and a lot of this call to action. In other words, writing the member of Congress. You have a resource. We have a resource too on our website, cherokee.org. There's a civic action tab. You can see a template letter, and you can adapt that to meet the kind of message that you want to send. I think together we can do a great deal, but right now it's about writing members of Congress. As old fashioned as that sounds, Sean, it works, especially if it's a genuine letter from a constituent.
Absolutely. And we got two ways that you can do that. And we encourage you to do both of them. Go to the Cherokee Nation website, print out the letter, send it in an envelope, get that to them. We also have where you can go on our website, lakotalaw.org. You can put in your zip code. It will pull up the people that you need to contact. You can send them an email and show them your support. And we need to bombard them no matter where you stand as an indigenous, non-indigenous, because treaty rights for the Cherokee Nation is great for all tribes. And it's also great for all U.S. citizens, as we require the U.S. government. One of my favorite quotes, Chief Hoskins, is, by Russell Means, when he said, he talked about, being called a radical and all this. He said, the only thing I've ever asked, been shot for, stabbed for, thrown in jail for, is to ask and demand that the United States of America live up to their own laws. And I think that as people of dual citizens of both our tribal nations and the United States, we should require and mandate that the United States of America live up to their laws.
That is so well put. Asking and demanding that the United States follow its own laws. And you and I both know the truth of the matter, which is the United States has never just voluntarily ceded ground on significant legal issues involving Indian country, we have to ask and we have to demand. I say ask because we do try to approach it in a respectful way. In this instance, we're talking about an institution that's important, the House of Representatives. But at some point, there has to be this not only ask, but demand. Is this country going to do the right thing? Does the country mean what it says when it agrees to something in a treaty? Does the United States agree that even if it held the Cherokee Nation to account with the Treaty of New Echota by forcibly removing people and taking the lives of a quarter of a population, isn't the least they can do to live up to the rest of that treaty and then live up to all the treaties? If the answer is not yes, John, I'm not sure what sort of world we live in or what sort of country we live in, but I'm an optimist. And I think that the time is now and the time is right. The United States will concede that it must follow this. It's not going to happen automatically. And I think with Lakota law and with the Cherokee Nation and with natives raising their voice across the country, we'll get this done.
Absolutely. Once again, Chief Hoskin, we want to thank you for joining us. And again, I want to thank you for being, I want to say this new level of tribal leadership that's holding that, but it's really returned to what our ancestors were doing in the beginning. And so I appreciate so much the way that you're leading by example, that you're not waiting around, you're pushing the efforts for all of our people. We thank you for coming on the show, and we thank you for, once again, for all that you do.
Waddell, my friend, thank you.